Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. There is a figure that has haunted the imagination of the world for centuries, armoured in lacquered steel, carrying two swords, and bound by a code that placed honour above survival itself, the samurai. But the real story is stranger, richer, and far more human than the legend suggests. Before the poetry, before the blade, before the cherry blossoms falling over silent graves, there was a society that invented these warriors out of necessity, shaped them through centuries of war, and then, when peace finally arrived, had absolutely no idea what to do with them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before the samurai, Japan's ancient foundations. The story of the samurai does not begin with a sword, it begins with rice. To understand how Japan produced one of the most distinctive warrior cultures in human history, you have to go back much further than most people expect. You have to go back to the islands themselves, to the geography that shaped everything. Japan is a chain of 4 main islands and thousands of smaller ones, strung along the Pacific like a curved spine of volcanic rock. Mountains dominate the landscape. Flat arable land is scarce. Rivers run short and steep. The sea is never far away, and the islands sit on the Pacific Ring of Fire, which means earthquakes, tsunamis, and eruptions are simply part of the background noise of life. This geography did something important. It made Japan difficult to invade from the outside, which gave its civilization time to develop on its own terms. But it also made internal competition intense, because good farmland was limited, and whoever controlled the rice paddies controlled everything. That tension between clans fighting over productive land would eventually produce the samurai. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The earliest traces of human life in Japan stretch back tens of thousands of years. The Yamon people, whose name comes from the rope patterns pressed into their distinctive pottery, lived as hunter-gatherers and fishermen across the archipelago for an extraordinarily long period. Their culture was remarkably sophisticated for a pre-agricultural society, producing some of the world's earliest known pottery. They were not farmers, but they were not simple either. They built settlements, maintained trade networks, and left behind figurines of clay that suggest rich ritual lives. Around 300 BCE, a new wave of migration from the Korean peninsula and mainland China brought something transformative: wet rice agriculture. These newcomers, associated with what archaeologists call the Yayoi culture, introduced not only rice cultivation but bronze and iron metalworking, weaving, and a more sedentary way of life. The Yayoi mixed with the existing Jomon population, and over generations a new society emerged. One organised around villages, governed by clan leaders, sustained by paddies flooded with carefully managed water. Rice was not just food, it was wealth, power, and political currency. By the first few centuries of the Common Era, Japan was a patchwork of competing chiefdoms. Chinese records, which are among the earliest written sources describing Japan, mention a land they called Wa, governed by dozens of small kingdoms. One of the most intriguing figures mentioned is a queen named Himiko, a shamanic ruler who wielded both religious and political authority. She's described as unmarried, living in seclusion, attended by 1,000 women, communicating with heaven through ritual and divination. Himiko is one of those historical figures who feels almost too interesting to be true, and yet there she is, in the pages of Chinese chronicles from the 3rd century. By the late 4th and 5th centuries, a more unified political order was taking shape in central Japan, in the Yamato region, what is now Nara and Osaka. The Yamato rulers gradually extended their authority over rival clans through a mixture of military pressure, political marriage, and a concept that would become absolutely central to Japanese political life for over a millennium: the idea that the ruling family was descended from the gods, specifically from the sun goddess Amaterasu, one of the central deities of the religion we now call Shinto. Shinto is not a religion with a single founder or a written scripture in the way that Christianity or Buddhism are. It is more a collection of practices, beliefs, and relationships centered on nature spirits called kami, which inhabit rivers, mountains, trees, and all manner of natural phenomena. The imperial family's claim to divine descent was not simply propaganda, though it was certainly useful propaganda. It reflected a genuine worldview in which the boundary between the human and the sacred was porous and negotiable. In the 6th century, Buddhism arrived from Korea and China, bringing with it not only a new faith but an entire package of continental civilization: written characters, administrative systems, art, architecture, and philosophy. The introduction of Buddhism was not without conflict. The Mononobe clan, guardians of traditional Shinto practices, opposed it. The Soga clan, who had grown wealthy through trade and continental connections, supported it. The Soga won that particular argument, and Buddhism was adopted alongside rather than instead of Shinto, a coexistence that has characterized Japanese religious life ever since. The 7th century saw attempts to build a more centralized state on Chinese models. The Taika reform of 646 reorganized land, taxation, and administration. A Chinese-style bureaucracy was established. Chinese writing systems and classical Chinese literature became the tools of educated elites. The capital shifted from place to place following each new emperor in the old belief that death polluted a site and required a fresh start, which sounds exhausting, and presumably was. By 710, the capital was fixed at Nara, a city laid out in a neat grid modelled on the Tang Chinese capital of Chang'an. Nara was a Buddhist city in a fundamental sense. Great temples rose across it, their wooden halls painted vermilion and gold. The most ambitious of all was Todaiji, which housed a colossal bronze Buddha, seated in gilded serenity, the largest bronze statue in the world at the time. The Nara period produced remarkable literature and poetry. The Manyoshu, an anthology compiled in the late 8th century, gathers 4,500 poems from across Japanese society, from emperors to frontier guards, all written in a spirit of tender attention to the natural world. In 794, the capital moved again, this time to Heian-kyu, the city of tranquil peace. We know it today as Kyoto, and Heian, Japan, which lasted from 794 to 1185, is one of the most aesthetically distinctive civilizations in world history. But beneath its exquisite surface, something was already beginning to stir, something that would eventually shatter the tranquility for good. The rise of the warrior class. Heian, Japan is the Japan of the tale of Genji, the world's first novel, written around the year 1000 by a lady of the court named Murasaki Shikibu. It is a Japan of incense competitions and poetry exchanges, of moonlit gardens and layered silk robes whose colours changed with the seasons. Court nobles spent their days composing verses, attending ceremonies, and engaging in the extraordinarily nuanced social rituals of the imperial court. It was, by any reasonable standard, a remarkable civilization. It was also deeply impractical when it came to defending itself. The Heian court had largely delegated the messier business of governing the provinces to powerful aristocratic families. The Fujiwara clan in particular had perfected a system of indirect control so elegant it was almost architectural. They married their daughters to emperors, became the grandfathers of future emperors, and ruled as regents in the name of rulers who were still in childhood or had been encouraged to retire early. The emperor reigned, the Fujiwara governed. It was, one has to admit, a remarkably efficient arrangement for the Fujiwara. But the provinces were a different matter entirely. Out in the countryside, away from the incense and poetry, local landowners were dealing with the realities of a world that required actual physical force to manage. Bandits threatened trade routes. Local disputes over land and water rights required resolution that went beyond the composition of a well-turned verse. The central government, focused on court ritual and factional maneuvering, had progressively lost interest in funding, training, or deploying the kind of military force the provinces needed. So the provinces found their own solution. They grew their own. Local landowners began organizing themselves and their retainers into armed groups. They developed fighting techniques suited to Japan's terrain. Mounted archery became a defining skill. A Japanese warrior on horseback drawing a great asymmetrical bow was a highly specialized instrument of violence. The bow in this period was the prestige weapon, not the sword. Swords were sidearms, backups for when your horse was down or your quiver was empty. The image of the samurai as primarily a swordsman came later. These early warriors are the direct ancestors of the samurai, though the word itself takes time to crystallize. The term samurai derives from a verb meaning to serve, and that etymology is worth sitting with for a moment. From the very beginning, the warrior's identity was relational. He was defined not by his own power alone, but by his service to someone above him. This relationship between lord and retainer would become the central organizing principle of samurai society. The great warrior clans of the Heian period traced their lineages back to the imperial family itself. The two most important were the Minamoto, also known by the Chinese reading of their name, Genji, and the Taira, also known as Heike. Both clans were founded by princes who had been removed from the imperial line to reduce the expense of maintaining large imperial families. Given surnames and sent out into the provinces, they built power bases far from the capital. By the 10th century, these clans were already formidable. In 939, a warrior named Taira no Masakado seized control of much of eastern Japan, declared himself a new emperor, and was only brought down by other warriors dispatched by the court, notably Fujiwara no Hidesato and Taira no Sadamori. In the same year, another warrior, Fujiwara no Sumitomo, led a pirate uprising in the western seas. These were not minor incidents. They demonstrated that the central government's grip on the provinces had loosened considerably, and that the only effective response to warrior violence was more warrior violence. Over the following century, the great clans developed complex internal hierarchies, training traditions, and a warrior ethos that distinguished them from both the court aristocrats and the common farmers. They did not yet have a formal written code. The ethics of the warrior class in this period were transmitted through practice, story, and example, rather than through philosophy. But certain values were already in place: loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, skill with horse and bow, and a particular relationship with death that set the warrior apart from other social classes. The warrior's willingness to die in service of his lord was not simply bravado, it was the essential condition of his social existence. A warrior who fled the battlefield, who surrendered when he might have died fighting, faced something worse than death in practical terms. He faced social annihilation. He would be remembered as a coward. His descendants would carry that shame. In a society where lineage and reputation were the primary currencies of status, this threat was existential in the deepest sense. As the Heian period progressed, the court found itself increasingly dependent on these warrior clans to manage conflicts it could not handle itself. The Minamoto and Taira were called to the capital to serve as police, as enforcers, as military specialists. They gained influence, they accumulated rewards, and inevitably they began to develop political ambitions of their own. The court, for its part, tried to manage these dangerous tools by playing the clans against each other. It worked, for a while. But by the mid-12th century, the tensions had built to a point where the entire elegant structure of Heian aristocratic civilization was about to come crashing down, not gradually, but in the space of a few devastating decades. What happened next was the beginning of the world as the samurai knew it. The Genpei War and the birth of the shogunate. The event that cracked the Heian world open was not a foreign invasion, it was a succession dispute. These things have a way of metastasizing. In 1156, a conflict over who should control the imperial succession and the Fujiwara regency escalated into brief but significant armed conflict in Kyoto itself. The Hogan disturbance, as it became known, was startling for several reasons. Warriors drawn from both the Minamoto and Taira clans fought on both sides of the dispute. The fighting took place in the streets and precincts of the capital, and when it was over, the victorious side executed its opponents, including members of the aristocracy, in ways that had not been seen in the capital for centuries. Japan had been reminded that beneath the surface of court elegance, violence was available and could be deployed. 3 years later, another conflict, the Heiji disturbance of 1159, resulted in the near annihilation of the Minamoto leadership. The Taira clan emerged dominant, and their leader, Taira no Kiyomori, rose to a position of unprecedented power. Kiyomori was a fascinating figure. He essentially became what the Fujiwara had been, a man who ruled through the imperial institution rather than displacing it. He married his daughter to the emperor. His grandson became emperor. He packed the court with his own family members. He was, in other words, trying to play the aristocratic game with a warrior clan's resources. For a while it worked brilliantly. But Kiyomori made enemies. The arrogance of Taira power alienated other clans. Retired emperors who felt excluded from influence began quietly supporting alternatives, and the Minamoto, though reduced, had not been eliminated entirely. A young survivor named Minamoto no Yoritomo had been spared execution in 1159 because of his youth, sent into exile in the Izu Peninsula under the supervision of a local Taira ally. He spent 20 years there, thinking, waiting, and cultivating relationships. When Kiyomori died in 1181, reportedly of a fever so intense that his attendants could not bear to approach him, the Taira edifice began to shake. Yoritomo raised his banner in the east in 1180 and the Genpei War began. The Genpei War lasted 5 years, from 1180 to 1185, and it was the foundational conflict of Japanese warrior culture. Everything that came afterward was shaped by its battles, its heroes, and its poetry. If you know anything about samurai Japan, you probably know something from this war without realizing it, because the stories it generated became the core of Japanese warrior mythology. The war split Japan geographically and politically. Yoritomo commanded eastern Japan, building his power base at Kamakura, far from the court in Kyoto. He was a superb organizer and political operator, more comfortable managing men and alliances than personally leading charges. His cousin, Minamoto no Yoshinaka, seized Kyoto itself but proved an uncontrollable force, alienating the city's population with the rough behavior of his eastern troops, and was eliminated by Yoritomo's own forces. War is messy. The most celebrated warrior of the conflict was Yoritomo's younger brother Minamoto no Yoshitsune. Yoshitsune was what you might call the exact opposite of his brother. Where Yoritomo was cautious and calculating, Yoshitsune was reckless and brilliant. He had a genius for tactical improvisation. At the Battle of Ichinotani in 1184, he led a cavalry charge down a steep cliff that the Taira had left unguarded because they considered it impassable. It very nearly was impassable, but Yoshitsune did it anyway. It worked. The Taira were routed. The decisive naval engagement came at Dan-no-Yora in 1185 in the straits between the main island of Honshu and Kyushu. The Taira were at home on the water, the Minamoto less so. But betrayal, the eternal wild card of medieval warfare, tipped the balance. A Taira commander switched sides at a critical moment, revealing which vessel carried the child emperor Antoku. Facing capture and defeat, the Taira women threw themselves into the sea. The emperor's grandmother, holding the 7-year-old emperor in her arms, told him the bottom of the sea was another capital, and walked into the water. The Genpei War ended with the total destruction of the Taira as a political power. The sea was so thick with the dead that the crabs in the Shimonoseki Strait are said to bear faces on their shells that resemble drowned samurai. People still say that centuries later. The hiki crabs. Look it up if you want something to keep you awake. Actually, no, don't. You should be going to sleep. Yoritomo's victory was political as much as military. In 1185, he secured the right to appoint military governors, called shugo, and land stewards, called jito, throughout Japan. This was the mechanism by which he built a genuine national network of authority, without technically displacing the imperial court in Kyoto. In 1192, he received the title Sei Taishogun, meaning commander-in-chief of the expedition against the barbarians, shortened to shogun. His government at Kamakura became known as the Bakufu, the tent government. The age of warrior rule had begun. Kamakura, Japan, the first warrior government Yoritomo died in 1199, and nobody is entirely sure how. The official version involves falling from a horse after attending a bridge dedication ceremony. Some historians accept this. Others raise an eyebrow. The man had survived decades of political violence, exile, and civil war, and he fell off a horse at a bridge opening. Japan, you are full of surprises. Whatever the cause, his death created an immediate succession problem. His sons proved unable to consolidate power. The Hojo clan, relatives of Yoritomo's wife Hojo Masako, stepped into the vacuum. Masako herself was a formidable figure. After Yoritomo's death, she took Buddhist vows but remained intensely involved in politics. When her own father attempted to act against the Minamoto legacy, she gave a speech to the assembled warriors at Kamakura that is remembered to this day, reminding them of the loyalty they owed to Yoritomo's memory and appealing to their sense of honor. The warriors chose her cause. She was known afterward as the Nun Shogun. The Hojo served as regents to a series of puppet shoguns, a pattern that should sound familiar if you've been paying attention to Japanese political history. Somebody is always the power behind somebody else. The Kamakura period, from 1185 to 1333, was the first sustained experiment in warrior governance. It was not a military dictatorship in the modern sense. The emperor still reigned in Kyoto. The court aristocracy still performed its rituals and produced its poetry. But real authority, the ability to make binding decisions about land, law, and military power, had moved to the east, to the rough, practical, slightly mud-stained world of Kamakura. Kamakura was a deliberately chosen location. It was defensible, surrounded by hills with limited access points close to the sea. It was a warrior's city in a way that Kyoto never was. The aesthetic of Kamakura was correspondingly different. The great temples of Kamakura had a directness, a solidity, that contrasted with the more refined elegance of high-end Buddhist art. The famous Kotoku Inn, The great bronze Buddha of Kamakura sits outdoors today because the hall that once sheltered it was swept away by a tsunami and never rebuilt. There is something appropriate about that. A warrior's Buddha sitting in the open air, exposed to the elements, enduring. The Kamakura system was built on a specific relationship between the shogunate and its vassals. The Gokenin, or housemen, were warriors who owed direct allegiance to Kamakura in exchange for confirmation of their land rights and military protection. This was, in essence, a contractual relationship. The shogunate protected your land, you provided military service. Loyalty was real, but it was also reciprocal, rooted in mutual obligation. When the shogunate failed to deliver its side of the bargain, loyalty could evaporate. Law in Kamakura was a patchwork. The Joey Formulary of 1232 was the first written legal code produced by a warrior government in Japan. It was pragmatic, direct, and surprisingly fair in some of its provisions. It dealt with land disputes, inheritance, and the conduct of lawsuits in terms that reflected warrior values rather than aristocratic convention. Women in the Kamakura period had inheritance rights that would later be curtailed. Daughters could inherit land. Widows could manage estates. This was not equality by any modern standard. But it was more than women would have in later centuries of Japanese history. Religion in the Kamakura period exploded with creativity. New forms of Buddhism arrived and took hold with extraordinary speed. Pure Land Buddhism, which promised salvation through devotion to Amida Buddha and the simple recitation of his name, spread among both warriors and commoners. The monk Honin and his student Shinran argued that in this degenerate age, complicated esoteric practice was beyond most people. Sincere faith in Amida's compassion was enough. This was, in its way, a revolutionary doctrine, Buddhism accessible to everyone, not just specialists. Nichiren, a fierce and combative monk who had none of the gentle qualities his name might suggest, declared that the Lotus Sutra alone contained the truth, and that Japan's disasters were divine punishment for straying from it. He was exiled twice, nearly executed once, and remained absolutely certain he was right throughout. History would call his tradition Nichiren Buddhism. His followers would be notable for their vigour ever afterward. And then there was Zen. More on that shortly because Zen deserves its own chapter. The Kamakura period ended not with a quiet transition, but with a rebellion. Emperor Go-Daigo, chafing under the reality that the emperor was a ceremonial figure while warriors made the real decisions, organised resistance. His first attempt failed, he was exiled, he escaped, he tried again. And in 1333 he succeeded briefly in what became known as the Kenmu Restoration, an attempt to return real power to the imperial throne. It lasted roughly 2 years before the warrior class reasserted itself under a new shogunate. But that is a story for the next chapter. Zen, Bushido, and the samurai mind. Here is something worth pausing to consider before we go any further. The warriors of medieval Japan, men who spent their professional lives practicing and in many cases actually committing lethal violence, became the primary patrons of Zen Buddhism in Japan. They funded its monasteries, sought out its teachers, and engaged with its practices with a seriousness that went well beyond mere fashionable piety. This seems contradictory on the surface. It stops seeming contradictory the moment you think carefully about what Zen actually offers. Zen, which derives from the Chinese Chan tradition, which itself developed from Indian Buddhist meditation practices carried across Central Asia along the Silk Road, is not primarily a religion in the sense of a system of beliefs about the nature of the universe. It is not primarily about doctrine or scripture or the correct understanding of theological propositions. It is about direct experience. It emphasizes seated meditation, called zazen, and a variety of practices specifically designed to cut through conceptual thinking, to bypass the ordinary machinery of deliberation and analysis, and to arrive at unmediated insight into the nature of reality as it actually is rather than as the thinking mind represents it to itself. The great Zen teachers were famous for methods that seem bizarre outside their context. Paradoxical questions with no logical answer, sudden shouts delivered without warning, unexpected physical gestures at moments of intense concentration. All of these were designed to accomplish the same thing, to jolt the student past the ordinary habits of mind and into something more direct and more immediate. For a samurai, the practical logic of this was not difficult to follow. A warrior whose life depended on reacting with complete clarity in a fraction of a second had one enemy above all others that no amount of physical training could reliably defeat. That enemy was hesitation. The moment between perceiving a threat and responding to it, the moment in which the ordinary thinking mind assessed the situation, weighed options, selected a response, and authorized its execution, was a moment that could get you killed. Zen training aimed at producing a mind that did not inhabit that moment, a mind that perceived and responded as a single continuous action, without the gap of deliberation in between. This was not mysticism pursued for its own sake or for the sake of spiritual credentials. It was a practical mental technology, pursued because it addressed a practical problem that warriors faced every time they entered serious combat. The monk Eisai brought the Rinzai school of Zen from China to Japan in the late 12th century, arriving at exactly the historical moment when the Kamakura warrior class was consolidating its identity and its cultural aspirations. The fit was immediate and lasting. Dogen, who established the Soto school after his own journey to China, brought a somewhat different emphasis, less focused on the sudden breakthrough of enlightenment, and more on the practice of zazen itself as the direct expression of awakened mind rather than a technique for achieving it. Both traditions found deep roots in Japan. Both found their primary patrons among the warriors. Zen monasteries became extraordinary centers of learning, ink painting, garden design, poetry, and cultural transmission, but they were built largely on warrior money and warrior interest. The influence of Zen on samurai aesthetics runs so deep that it can be difficult to see clearly precisely because it is everywhere. The concept of wabi, that quality of austere and imperfect beauty found in simple things, the rough ceramic bowl, the weathered wooden post, the moss growing on an old stone, is saturated with Zen sensibility. The tea ceremony developed in Zen monastery context before it became a samurai cultural obsession, carrying the monastery's emphasis on complete attention to simple actions into a formal practice that could be shared and transmitted and refined across generations. The art of ink painting, with its spare and decisive brushwork that had to be right the first time because there was no correcting it, reflected Zen values of presence and irreversibility. The dry rock gardens of Kyoto's great Zen temples, where raked gravel stands in for an ocean around carefully placed stones, are exercises in the Zen aesthetic of suggestion over statement, of empty space as meaningful rather than merely absent. All of these traditions were shaped in dialogue between Zen practitioners and warrior patrons. The aesthetic of the samurai class and the aesthetic of Zen Buddhism developed together, each influencing the other across several centuries of intimate connection. Now, about Bushido. This is where I want to be honest with you, because popular history has not always been honest about it, and the difference matters. The image of Bushido as an ancient warrior code, a comprehensive ethical philosophy that governed the samurai from their earliest origins, is in important ways a construction of much later periods projected backward onto the past. The word itself, meaning the way of the warrior, does appear in earlier texts, and medieval warriors absolutely had genuine ethical commitments, real values, practices they upheld and ideals they aspired to. Loyalty, courage, martial skill, a particular relationship with death and with reputation. These were real features of warrior culture across many centuries, but they were not systematically codified into a coherent philosophy during the medieval period. They were transmitted through practice and example and story, not through philosophical treatises that laid out a complete ethical system. The systematic articulation of Bushido as a comprehensive framework was largely a product of the Edo period, when samurai had a great deal of time and no wars to think about, and even more specifically a product of the late 19th century, when Japan was actively redefining its national identity in response to Western pressure. The most famous text associated with Bushido, a book actually titled Bushido, The Soul of Japan, was written by a Japanese Christian intellectual named Nitobe Nazo in 1899. It was written in English for a Western readership, and it was explicitly designed to explain Japanese values to people who had been raised in the tradition of European chivalry. Nitobe was arguing in effect that Japan had its own chivalric tradition, and that Western readers should recognize and respect it. This is a perfectly understandable intellectual project. It is just not the same thing as a historical account of what medieval warriors actually believed and practiced. What Bushido represents, honestly understood, is a cultural ideal rather than a historical reality, a vision of what the samurai could be and should have been, assembled from genuine historical materials but arranged with a retrospective tidiness that the actual past never quite possessed. Medieval samurai were human beings, which means they were treacherous and loyal, courageous and frightened, compassionate and brutal, in roughly the proportions you would expect from any large group of people placed under sustained and serious stress. They were not uniformly noble. They did not consistently live up to the ideals that later centuries would attribute to them. This should surprise nobody. No group of humans consistently lives up to its ideals. That is what makes ideals ideals rather than descriptions. None of this makes Bushido unimportant. Cultural ideals shape actual behavior even when they are partly fictional, perhaps especially when they are partly fictional, because the gap between ideal and reality creates the productive tension that motivates people to try harder. The samurai of the Edo period genuinely attempted to live according to the warrior ideals articulated in texts like the Hagakure, Yamamoto Tsunetomo's early 18th century meditation on warrior values, which insists with considerable urgency that the way of the samurai is found in death. Whether their medieval ancestors would have recognized or endorsed that exact formulation in those exact terms is a genuinely open question. What is real and documentable across all the centuries is the warrior's relationship with his own mortality. Not a comfortable relationship, not an easy one, but a sustained and serious engagement with the fact of death as the condition that gave the warrior's life its particular quality of meaning. The cherry blossom became the defining symbol of the samurai for exactly this reason, and the choice was not accidental. The cherry blossom blooms at the height of its beauty for roughly a week before it falls. It does not cling to the branch past its moment. It falls completely at the right time without resistance. Beauty that does not grasp at continuation. Life that burns briefly and entirely rather than persisting into slow diminishment. The samurai ideal was not to live long. It was to live with full commitment and to die at the appropriate moment without clinging past that moment into something that would reduce what the life had been. Seppuku, the ritual self-disembowelment that samurai facing disgrace or certain defeat could choose, was the ultimate physical expression of this philosophy. By any practical measure it was an agonizing death, but it was a chosen death, a controlled death, and within the framework of warrior values it preserved the essential dignity that surrender or passive acceptance of capture would have destroyed. The samurai worked very hard, through Zen practice and through the repeated deliberate contemplation of their own deaths, to reach a place where the fear of dying did not govern their choices. Whether they fully succeeded is a question that belongs to each individual warrior and to whatever passed through his mind on his last morning. History, with characteristic discretion, does not always record that part. The Mongol invasions. Divine wind. In 1274, something happened to Japan that had never happened before and would not happen again for 7 centuries. A foreign power attempted to invade. The Mongols under Kublai Khan had already conquered China, Korea, and vast swathes of Central Asia. They had sent envoys to Japan demanding submission. The Kamakura government had read these letters and essentially refused to respond, which in diplomatic terms is a fairly clear answer. Kublai Khan dispatched an invasion fleet of roughly 900 ships carrying perhaps 30,000 soldiers, a combined force of Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops, drawn from the full resources of an empire that had brought most of the known world to its knees. The Japanese defenders were initially shocked. Mongol tactics were nothing like what they expected. Japanese warrior culture had developed around a particular ritual of battle. Warriors would announce their names and lineages before combat, seek out worthy opponents of comparable status, and engage in individual or small-scale duels. This was warfare as a kind of honourable performance, bounded by convention. The Mongols did not read that particular rulebook. They fought in coordinated units, used explosives, fired poisoned arrows in volleys, and generally treated the Japanese warriors' individual challenges with complete indifference. A samurai stepping forward to announce his name to a Mongol army was the military equivalent of trying to have a polite conversation at a fireworks display. The Japanese suffered significant casualties in the initial engagements, but then something happened. A storm struck. The Mongol fleet, anchored in Hakata Bay, was battered by fierce winds and waves. The flat-bottomed riverboats that made up much of the fleet, never designed for open ocean conditions, were catastrophically vulnerable. The invasion force withdrew with heavy losses. In 1281, Kublai Khan tried again, this time with an enormous fleet of perhaps 4,000 ships and over 100,000 soldiers. The Japanese had spent the intervening 7 years building defensive walls along the Hakata Bay coastline and training for a different kind of warfare. The defenders held the seawall, and the invaders struggled to establish a beachhead. For months the stalemate held, and then, again, the weather intervened. A typhoon of exceptional ferocity struck the anchored Mongol fleet and destroyed it. Contemporary accounts say the sea was so thick with wreckage that a man could walk from ship to ship. The Japanese called this storm the kamikaze, the divine wind. The psychological impact of the Mongol invasions on Japanese warrior culture was immense. The gods, or more specifically the Shinto deities of Japan, had intervened to destroy the enemy. This interpretation reinforced the idea that Japan was a specially protected land, a divine country. The imperial institution and its connection to the Shinto deities gained prestige. The warriors who had fought at the seawall had their own complicated feelings. They had fought hard and relatively well in difficult circumstances, but the decisive factor was weather, not their own blades. Claiming rewards for a victory that the typhoon had largely delivered was awkward. The Kamakura shogunate struggled to adequately compensate the warriors who had served in the defense. In a typical war, victorious warriors received land taken from the defeated enemy, but there was no enemy land to distribute after a successful defense against invasion. The shogunate paid what it could, but many warriors felt shortchanged. This financial strain contributed to the growing discontent that would eventually bring Kamakura down. The Mongol invasions also left a stranger legacy. The very word kamikaze, divine wind, would be borrowed 7 centuries later in the Second World War as the name for the pilots of the special attack units who flew their planes into Allied warships in the final desperate years of the Pacific War. That connection between a medieval typhoon and a 20th century military strategy runs through the idea of Japan as a place that cannot be conquered, a place under divine protection. Whether that idea was true, whether any place is truly under divine protection, history has its own answers. But the belief shaped Japanese strategic thinking across centuries. The storms of 1274 and 1281 were not miracles. They were weather. The Pacific typhoon season reaches its peak in late summer and early autumn, exactly the seasons of the invasions. Kublai Khan, for all his genius as a conqueror, was unlucky with his timing. Japan was not saved by the gods. It was saved by meteorology and flat-bottomed boats that had no business being in the open sea in typhoon season. But history is made of how events are interpreted as much as how they unfold. The Ashikaga and the Age of Warring States Emperor Go-Daigo's Kenmu restoration, which briefly returned imperial authority in 1333, collapsed in 1336. The warrior who had helped him overthrow the Kamakura shogunate, a general named Ashikaga Takauji, turned against him, drove him from Kyoto and established a new shogunate. Go-Daigo fled south with the imperial regalia, the sacred sword, mirror and jewel that legitimized imperial authority, and set up a rival court in the mountains of Yoshino. For over half a century, Japan had 2 imperial courts simultaneously. The northern court in Kyoto, supported by the Ashikaga, and the southern court in Yoshino, insisting on its own legitimacy. Both were absolutely certain they were the real thing. This is the kind of historical situation that makes you deeply sympathetic to ordinary Japanese people trying to figure out who they were supposed to be loyal to on any given Tuesday. The Ashikaga shogunate, centered in the Muromachi district of Kyoto, was in many ways a more sophisticated political structure than Kamakura had been. The Ashikaga shoguns were deep in the cultural life of the capital. They were art collectors, patrons of theatre and poetry, practitioners of the tea ceremony. The third Ashikaga shogun, Yoshimitsu, was perhaps the most powerful, building the famous Kinkaku-ji, the Golden Pavilion, as part of his retirement residence. He negotiated with China, received the title King of Japan from the Ming Emperor, and for a brief period brought something approaching genuine peace and stability. But Yoshimitsu died in 1408, and the Ashikaga system never fully recovered its equilibrium. The shogunate's fundamental weakness was structural. Unlike the Kamakura system, which had maintained relatively direct control over its vassal warriors, the Ashikaga depended on regional lords called daimyo, who were powerful enough to challenge the central authority when it suited them. The shogunate tried to balance these powers against each other, playing one daimyo off against another. This worked until it stopped working, which it eventually did in spectacular fashion. The Onin War began in 1467. It started over a succession dispute in one of the great regional warrior families. It spread, as succession disputes in medieval Japan tended to do, into something much larger. For 11 years, armies burned their way through Kyoto, reducing much of the ancient capital to ash. When the Onin War finally exhausted itself in 1477, it had not resolved anything. It had simply destroyed a great deal. The Ashikaga shogunate survived in name, increasingly powerless, kept alive mostly by inertia. The real power was fragmenting outward to the regional daimyo. What followed is called the Sengoku period, the Age of Warring States. borrowing a name from a turbulent era of ancient Chinese history. It lasted from roughly 1467 to 1590, and it was the most intense, sustained, and consequential period of warfare in Japanese history. The country dissolved into a kaleidoscope of competing domains. 100 daimyo raised armies and fought each other for territory. Alliances formed and broke. Yesterday's ally was tomorrow's enemy. Yesterday's subordinate was tomorrow's master. The word gekokujo, meaning the lower overthrowing the upper, became a description of the age. A new kind of samurai emerged from this environment, less concerned with lineage and ritual than with practical survival. The great military innovations of the Sengoku period were driven by necessity. Ashigaru, foot soldiers of low social origin, became essential components of armies in a way they had not been before. Effective command of large formations of spearmen required logistics, training, and administrative skill as much as personal valor. War became a matter of economics and organization as much as individual heroism, and then, in 1543, something arrived on the southern island of Kyushu that would transform Japanese warfare permanently. Portuguese traders landed at Tanegashima, bringing with them matchlock firearms. The Japanese called them Tanegashima after the island, or Teppo, and they were fascinated. Within a decade, Japanese craftsmen were producing firearms in large numbers. Within 2 decades, firearms were decisive elements of Japanese battle tactics. The samurai, who had spent years mastering the bow, had to adapt or be rendered irrelevant. Some adapted. Some resented the gun as ungentlemanly. History did not wait for the ungentlemanly question to be resolved. The culture of the Sengoku period was, despite or perhaps because of its violence, extraordinarily creative. No theatre, which had developed in the Ashikaga period under the genius of Zeami Kiyo, continued to be patronized by the warrior elite. Linked poetry, called renga, provided collective artistic experience, and a particular aesthetic sensibility was crystallizing, one that valued impermanence, asymmetry, and the subtle beauty of things that do not advertise themselves. The tea ceremony deserves particular mention here. What had begun as a Zen monastic practice for alertness during meditation had evolved, under the influence of tea masters like Murata Juko and later Senno Rikyu, into something extraordinary. The tea ceremony in its mature form was a practice of deliberate ritualized attention. A small room, perhaps 2 tatami mats in size, rough ceramic bowls, a bamboo whisk, the sound of water heating over charcoal. In the middle of a century of war and fire and treachery, the tea room was a space of enforced quiet and genuine beauty. Warriors who spent their days in the management of violence sought out these moments of stillness with an intensity that makes complete sense. The great daimyo of the age were often passionate practitioners of tea. Some of them were as feared in the tea room as on the battlefield. The 3 unifiers, Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu. By the middle of the 16th century, the question hanging over Japan was whether anyone could bring the Sengoku chaos to an end. The answer was yes, but it took 3 men, each with a radically different personality, working in sequence over roughly 40 years. The first was Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was born in 1534 in Owari province, a small domain in central Japan. His early reputation was as a fool, a wild young man with eccentric habits. He was called Owari no Outsuke, the Fool of Owari. His enemies underestimated him, which turned out to be a poor decision with lasting consequences. At the Battle of Okazama in 1560, Nobunaga's small force of roughly 2,000 men attacked the camp of the daimyo Imagawa Yoshimoto, whose army numbered perhaps 25,000, and killed him. The odds were absurd. The outcome was decisive. After Okazama, nobody called Nobunaga a fool anymore. What made Nobunaga extraordinary was his complete willingness to discard conventions that had outlived their usefulness. He understood firearms. While other commanders were still debating whether guns were honourable, Nobunaga was working out how to use them in coordinated volley fire against cavalry, a tactic that neutralized the mounted warrior, who had been the dominant military unit for centuries. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he deployed arquebusiers in rotating volleys behind wooden palisades and effectively destroyed the cavalry charges of the Takeda clan, who were considered the finest horsemen in Japan. It was not elegant. It worked. Nobunaga was also ruthless in ways that made contemporaries uncomfortable. He was a rationalist in an age of religious warfare. When the Buddhist monks of the Enryakuji temple complex on Mount Hiei, who had been a political power for centuries and who had taken the wrong side against him, refused to yield, Nobunaga burned the entire complex to the ground. The loss of life was enormous. The religious communities of the Iko-Iki, militant Pure Land Buddhist congregations that had established autonomous domains in several provinces, fought Nobunaga for years and were eventually crushed with similar finality. He had no patience for institutions that claimed they were above the practical realities of power. He also had something genuinely unusual for his era: intellectual curiosity. He was fascinated by the Jesuit missionaries who had arrived in Japan in 1549 with Francis Xavier. He gave them audiences, asked them questions, collected foreign novelties including globes and clocks, and the occasional African retainer whose name was Yasuke, and who became something of a celebrity at Nobunaga's court. Whether Nobunaga was interested in Christianity as a religion, or simply found the foreigners useful as both sources of information and as potential irritants to his Buddhist enemies, is debated. Probably both. In 1582, Nobunaga was attacked and killed by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, in what is called the Honnoji incident. He was surrounded in a Kyoto temple with a small retinue, with no possibility of escape or victory. According to accounts, he fought with a bow and then a spear until wounded, then withdrew into a room and burned. He was 48 years old. He was 10 days away from what would have been the decisive campaign of his career. Mitsuhide lasted as master of Japan for 13 days. He is sometimes called the 13-day shogun. Nobunaga's general Toyotomi Hideyoshi force marched his army back from a campaign in western Japan, defeated Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki, and presented himself as the avenger of Nobunaga's death. He was extraordinarily good at politics. Hideyoshi's story is one of the most remarkable in Japanese history. He was born in 1537 to a peasant family in Owari. He had no warrior lineage whatsoever. He entered Nobunaga's service as a sandal-bearer. He rose through absolutely everything by virtue of intelligence, charm, and a ruthless strategic mind that he wrapped in a personality so engaging that people genuinely liked him, even as he was outmaneuvering them. He was small, and contemporary portraits suggest rather monkey-like features, which he was well aware of and apparently comfortable enough with to joke about. He could not become shogun because he lacked the Minamoto lineage the title required. He arranged to be adopted by a noble family and became imperial regent instead. Hideyoshi completed the unification of Japan by 1590, bringing the last resistant daimyo of northern Japan to submission. He then, with the particular grandiosity of a man who had risen from nothing to rule everything, decided to conquer China. He would invade through Korea. The Korean campaigns of 1592 to 1598 were catastrophic. Japanese forces initially swept through Korea with devastating speed, but Chinese intervention stabilized the front, and the campaign settled into a brutal, inconclusive stalemate. Hideyoshi died in 1598 while the second invasion was still ongoing. His commanders negotiated a withdrawal. Japan had gained nothing and lost a great deal. On his deathbed, Hideyoshi begged his generals to protect his young son Hideyori. 5 great lords swore oaths to do so. Within 2 years, one of them had effectively taken control and was clearly positioning himself for supreme power. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu was born in 1542 in Mikawa province, a relatively minor lord. He had spent his childhood as a hostage, first of one rival clan and then another, a common fate for the sons of minor lords in the Sengoku period. He learned patience in those years, extraordinary, almost inhuman patience. He had been an ally of Nobunaga for decades, survived Hideyoshi's rise by submitting cleverly and serving loyally, and outlasted them both. He was 57 years old when Hideyoshi died, an age at which most men of his era were either dead or elderly. At the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, Ieyasu defeated the coalition that had formed to protect Hideyori's inheritance. It was the largest battle in Japanese history to that point. Roughly 160,000 men engaged over a single day. The decisive moment came, again, from betrayal. Several daimyo who had committed to the Eastern Coalition withdrew at the crucial moment. The Western Coalition collapsed. Ieyasu was master of Japan. In 1603 he received the title shogun. In 1605 he transferred it to his son Hidetada, demonstrating clearly that unlike Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, he was thinking dynastically. The Tokugawa shogunate would last for 260 years. In 1615, he eliminated the last remnants of the Toyotomi cause at the siege of Osaka Castle, where Hideyori died either by suicide or in the flames of the burning keep. The Sengoku period was over. The Tokugawa Peace, Samurai in a World Without War. The Tokugawa period, which lasted from 1603 to 1868, presented the samurai class with a problem that had genuinely never arisen before in anything like the same form. It was not a problem of enemies or resources or political legitimacy or natural disaster. It was a problem that sounds almost comic when stated plainly and becomes less comic the longer you think about it. There was no war. This requires some qualification. The Edo period was not complete peace in any absolute sense. The suppression of Christianity, which had spread substantially through the late 16th century, largely due to the enthusiasm of Jesuit missionaries and the political calculations of several important daimyo, produced episodes of considerable violence. The Tokugawa viewed Christianity not primarily as a theological problem, though they had concerns there too, but as a political one. A religion that demanded ultimate loyalty to a foreign god and a foreign institution sat uncomfortably within a system built entirely on the premise that loyalty to the Tokugawa was the organizing principle of Japanese political life. The Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 to 1638, in which a predominantly Christian peasant population in northern Kyushu rose against their domain lords and held a crumbling castle for months against a government army of over 100,000, was suppressed with a thoroughness that left very few survivors. Christianity was driven underground and then effectively eliminated as a visible social force, its practitioners detected through a system of mandatory temple registration that enrolled every Japanese family in a local Buddhist temple, which then functioned as a combination census bureau and surveillance apparatus. This was efficient. It was also brutal in the specific cases where hidden Christians were identified. There were also the complex succession struggles and factional conflicts of the shogunate's early decades, and occasional domain uprisings that required military response, but these were exceptional circumstances, managed and contained. Compared to the Sengoku period, that century of continuous warfare during which no domain could feel secure and no alliance could be trusted past the next season, the Edo period was a condition of domestic stability so profound and so sustained that it had no real precedent in Japanese history. For 2.5 centuries, the samurai class existed primarily for a purpose that was almost never required of it. The analogy that comes to mind is this. Imagine training your entire life to be a firefighter, studying the theory and practice of fire with complete dedication, maintaining your equipment and your physical readiness with daily discipline, organizing your entire identity and social existence around your role as a person who fights fires, and then imagine that there are almost no fires. You still need to be ready. The readiness is still meaningful, still the organizing principle of your professional life. But the thing you are ready for simply does not happen, year after year, decade after decade, across the entire span of a career and into the careers of your children and your children's children. That was the Edo period samurai. Administrators and bureaucrats and scholars who wore swords and trained in martial arts and organized their ethical lives around the values of a warrior tradition in a country that had run out of wars to fight. The swords remained symbols of status and identity. The training continued as both cultural practice and philosophical discipline. But actual combat was a memory preserved in stories and training manuals, and the occasional dramatic account of battles fought by grandfathers and great-grandfathers, rather than a lived professional reality. The Tokugawa addressed the political dimensions of this situation with systematic thoroughness. A warrior class with no war to fight and no administrative function was a potentially destabilizing force, men trained for violence with nothing constructive to do with that training. The solution was to give them both an administrative function and a social hierarchy to maintain and to be seen maintaining. Japan was divided into domains called Han, each administered by a daimyo who owed loyalty directly to the Tokugawa. The daimyo governed their territories, managed their retainers, collected taxes, maintained order, and were responsible for the stability of their domains. Below them, the samurai retainers served as the administrative backbone of domain government, managing records, supervising agricultural production, adjudicating local disputes, and performing the 100 bureaucratic functions that keeping a complex society organized requires. The masterstroke of Tokugawa control was the Sankin-Katai system, the requirement that every daimyo spend alternating years in Edo and in his home domain. While in Edo, the daimyo maintained elaborate households appropriate to his status. While in his domain, his family remained in Edo. The system was elegant in its implications. It kept daimyo perpetually in motion, perpetually spending enormous sums on the processions and establishments that their status required, and perpetually separated from either their home base or their family, never quite in a position to consolidate the kind of independent power that might threaten the Tokugawa. The processions themselves, great cavalcades of hundreds or thousands of attendants moving along the major roads of Japan, became economic engines that sustained the towns and post stations along their routes. The shogunate had turned the potential threat of a mobile warrior aristocracy into a structural support for both the economy and the surveillance apparatus simultaneously. The official social hierarchy of the Edo period was organized into 4 categories, arranged in descending order of theoretical prestige: samurai at the top, then farmers, whose productive labor sustained the entire structure, then artisans who made useful things, then merchants, who merely moved things around and profited from the movement without contributing anything that Confucian thought considered genuinely valuable. This ranking reflected the Neo-Confucian values the Tokugawa had adopted as their official ideology, a philosophy that valued productive labor and social stability and looked skeptically at the accumulation of wealth through commerce. Reality was, as it tends to be, considerably more complicated than the organizational chart suggested. Wealthy merchants in Edo and Osaka accumulated fortunes that dwarfed the stipends of all but the most senior samurai retainers. They lived in houses that were officially modest, since sumptuary laws regulated what the lower orders were permitted to display, and then filled those officially modest houses with extraordinary art, exquisite food, and every refinement that money could quietly purchase. The tension between the merchant class's official low status and its actual economic power was one of the defining creative frictions of the Edo period, generating a popular culture of considerable vitality precisely because it existed in the space between what the hierarchy said was important and what people's actual daily experience suggested was important. The samurai themselves varied enormously in their circumstances, a fact that the clean lines of the official hierarchy obscure. At the upper end were the great daimyo lords, the Fudai lords who had supported the Tokugawa before Sekigahara and were rewarded with the most strategically important domains, and the Tozama outside lords who had submitted after Sekigahara and were watched with the slightly suspicious attention one gives to people whose loyalty was secured by defeat rather than chosen freely. Below the daimyo stretched the vast range of samurai retainers, from senior officials who managed domain finances and policy and lived in genuine comfort, down to low-ranking foot soldiers who received stipends so modest that maintaining the appearances expected of their status required considerable ingenuity and occasional quiet desperation. A samurai who was secretly selling handmade goods to supplement his income was a more common figure in the Edo period than the official ideology of warrior dignity would have preferred to acknowledge. The Tokugawa managed threats to their authority with a thoroughness that bordered on the systematic in the most literal sense. The shogunate maintained inspectors who travelled the domains observing and reporting. It regulated marriages between great families, required permission for castle repairs, monitored the construction of fortifications with the attention of people who understood exactly what fortifications were for. The daimyo knew they were being watched. The watching was partly the point. A system in which everyone knew that deviation would be noticed and consequences would follow was a system that generated a great deal of compliance without requiring constant active enforcement. Japan under the Sakoku policies formalized in the 1630s was not entirely sealed from the outside world, but it was very close. Japanese subjects were forbidden from travelling abroad. The penalty for attempting to return if you had somehow gotten out was death, which constituted a fairly effective disincentive. Foreign ships were restricted to a small Dutch trading post on the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki harbour, and designated ports for Chinese and Korean vessels. Through Dejima in particular flowed a carefully managed trickle of information about European developments in science, medicine and natural philosophy, studied by Japanese scholars under the name Rangaku, Dutch learning, with an earnestness that the Dutch traders probably found both flattering and slightly baffling. For over 2 centuries, this closed, stable, hierarchical, and extraordinarily controlled world sustained itself. The Tokugawa had solved the problem of maintaining order by making disorder structurally almost impossible. They had solved the problem of a warrior class without wars by giving those warriors administrative purpose and cultural identity to fill the space that combat had vacated. And inside this closed world, with all that redirected energy and all that enforced stability and all those rice stipends arriving whether or not anyone had done anything particularly heroic to earn them, something unexpected happened. Culture exploded. Daily life, culture, and the arts of the samurai. To understand the Edo period, you have to understand something that sounds almost counterintuitive at first. Stability, whatever its political costs, is extraordinarily good for art. When people are not spending all their energy on survival, on the next battle or the next harvest, or whether the Lord Two Valleys over is going to raid your village before winter, they spend that energy on everything else. And the samurai class in the Edo period had a great deal of energy that suddenly had nowhere obvious to go. Here were men defined by war, sustained by the memory of war, trained from childhood in the arts of war, living in a country that had not seen serious domestic conflict in decades, and would not see it for more generations still. Their rice stipends arrived whether or not they drew their swords. Their administrative duties were real, but not exactly the stuff of legend. And so the samurai class, with its deep cultural self-consciousness and its considerable free time, poured itself into art, literature, philosophy, and the meticulous codification of practices that the Sengoku period had kept necessarily improvised. When you are not sure if you will be alive next week, you do not write lengthy treatises on the correct angle at which to hold a tea bowl. When peace arrives and stays, you absolutely do. The tea ceremony is perhaps the clearest example of this transformation. What had begun centuries earlier as a Zen monastic practice, a way of keeping monks alert during long meditation sessions, had evolved through the Muromachi and Sengoku periods into something increasingly elaborate and philosophically charged. The great tea master Sen no Rikyu had given it its most austere and perfect form. The small rough room, the handmade ceramic bowls, the deliberate imperfection of every element. And then he died in 1591, ordered to commit seppuku by Hideyoshi in an incident that remains genuinely mysterious even now. Scholars have debated it for centuries. Was it a political dispute? A question of artistic authority? A personal slight that escalated past recovery? Nobody knows for certain. Hideyoshi was a man of enormous power and unpredictable moods, and Rikyu was a man of enormous artistic authority and apparently insufficient deference. The combination proved fatal, but the schools of tea that Rikyu left behind continued and deepened. The ceremony became increasingly formalized in the Edo period, with different lineages preserving slightly different traditions, arguing gently over the correct way to fold a cloth or the proper silence between movements, each claiming fidelity to the master's true intention. Tea became the practice through which samurai engaged most directly with the values of wabi-sabi, that untranslatable aesthetic of imperfect, transient, incomplete beauty. A ceremony conducted in a room barely large enough to turn around in, using bowls that were rough and irregular and worth a fortune precisely because of that roughness, was both a philosophical statement about the nature of beauty and a practical refuge from the elaborate social performances that samurai hierarchy required every other hour of the day. Inside the tea room, everyone removed their swords. Rank was acknowledged but softened. The shared attention to small beautiful things was the point. For men who spent their working lives navigating a rigid and often exhausting social order, the tea room offered something surprisingly close to relief. Sword culture developed its own parallel intensification, and for exactly the same reason. Swords in the Edo period were almost never used for their primary purpose, which meant they could be appreciated for everything else. The great blades of earlier centuries, swords by the legendary Smith Masamune of Kamakura and his tradition, became objects of profound reverence. Collecting fine swords, studying their characteristics, understanding the different schools of smithing and their distinguishing qualities, these became serious intellectual pursuits for the warrior class. The sword was no longer primarily a weapon. It was the visible soul of the samurai, a spiritual object and an aesthetic masterwork that happened to also be capable of cutting a man in half, which was not something you were supposed to think about too often in polite company. The study of sword fighting kenjutsu proliferated into dozens of competing schools across the Edo period, each one claiming to transmit the true and essential spirit of the art, and each one convinced that the other schools were doing it slightly wrong. This is, when you think about it, exactly what happens to every discipline when it loses its practical urgency. When sword fighting was a matter of life and death, there was a brutal natural selection among techniques. When it became primarily a cultural and philosophical practice, the arguments moved from the battlefield to the dojo and became considerably more elaborate. Students trained with wooden swords, developed elaborate forms and kata, studied texts and lineages, and committed themselves to schools the way scholars committed themselves to philosophical traditions. The sword became a path, a do, rather than simply a tool. The most famous individual swordsman of this or any other era in Japanese history lived at the hinge point between the Sengoku's ending and the Edo period's beginning. Miyamoto Musashi, born around 1584 and dying in 1645, embodied the transition. He fought his serious duels in a world that still had them, and then wrote his most famous work in a world that was moving past them. The Book of Five Rings, dictated in the last years of his life from a cave in Kyushu, where he had retreated for final contemplation, is ostensibly a practical guide to sword strategy. It is organized around the 5 elements of ground, water, fire, wind, and void. It gives specific advice about footwork and distance, and the timing of cuts. But read it carefully, and what you find is a philosophy of attention, adaptability, and the relationship between mastered technique and intuitive response. How do you act with complete precision when you have no time to think? You prepare so thoroughly that thinking becomes unnecessary. You become the action. Musashi himself was, by all reliable accounts, extremely difficult to spend time with. He reportedly showed up late to scheduled duels, a habit that was partly tactical and partly one suspect's, a reflection of the kind of personality that simply does not feel bound by ordinary conventions. He used 2 swords simultaneously when one was the universal norm, having decided that the offhand was wasted if empty. He bathed infrequently and apparently did not consider this a problem worth addressing. He was the kind of person who is fascinating in retrospect and probably exhausting in person. The Book of Five Rings is, despite its author's social limitations, genuinely worth reading. Business schools assign it. Corporate strategy consultants cite it. This is a fate that Musashi, who considered merchants several rungs below warriors on the ladder of serious human endeavour, would almost certainly have found both baffling and slightly insulting. Literature in the Edo period reached audiences that would have been unimaginable in previous centuries. The key was printing technology, introduced from Korea in the early 17th century, which allowed books to be produced and sold in quantities that made literacy genuinely worthwhile for ordinary people. The urban merchant class, which was accumulating real wealth while officially occupying the bottom of the social hierarchy, was hungry for entertainment and increasingly able to afford it. The result was a flowering of popular literature that existed largely outside the elevated cultural traditions of the court and the warrior class. Ihara Saikaku wrote stories of merchant life that were frank about money, desire, and the gap between official morality and actual behavior. Matsubasho transformed the haiku, that compressed 3-line form organized around a seasonal image and a sudden shift of perspective, into one of the most refined and beloved artistic traditions in Japanese history. His journey account, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, which records his travels through the northeastern provinces in 1689 in a form that weaves prose reflection and haiku together like threads in cloth, is one of those books that makes you feel the world is both larger and more precisely itself than you had understood. It is also a samurai-era document in the deepest sense, saturated with the awareness of impermanence, with the beauty of things passing, with attention to the moment as the only place where life actually occurs. Kabuki theatre emerged in the early 17th century and almost immediately provoked official concern, which is usually a sign that something genuinely interesting is happening. Originally featuring female performers, it was banned from employing women by the authorities on grounds of public morality, a decision that produced the remarkable tradition of onagata, male specialists in female roles whose performances of femininity became an art form requiring decades of dedicated study. Kabuki was loud, colourful, emotional, and deliberately spectacular, everything that No was not. It served the merchant class's appetite for drama and sensation. It dealt with love affairs, revenge, loyalty, class transgression, and the many ways that human beings make a mess of their lives despite their best intentions. It remains a living performance tradition today. Woodblock printing gave Edo Japan its most globally recognized art form. Ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, captured actors and courtesans, landscapes and seasons, the faces of famous beauties, and the bodies of celebrated wrestlers, in bold lines and striking colors that combined technical mastery with immediate visual impact. Katsushika Hokusai produced his series 36 Views of Mount Fuji in the early 19th century, and the image known as the Great Wave off Kanagawa, in which a towering curl of grey-blue water dwarfs the distant white cone of Fuji, is probably the most reproduced single image in Japanese artistic history. It influenced European Impressionism. It appears on phone cases and coffee mugs in every country. Hokusai was in his 70s when he made it, and considered his earlier work an adequate preparation. He said that if he lived to 110, every dot and line would be alive. He died at 89, which history records as a loss. The samurai themselves, navigating all this cultural richness from within their particular philosophical predicament, produced a significant body of writing that tries to address the central tension of their situation. The Hagakure, dictated by the retired saga domain samurai Yamamoto Tsunetomo to a young scribe over a period of years in the early 18th century, insists with considerable urgency on holding to the warrior ideal in conditions of peace. Its most famous line, that the way of the samurai is found in death, is both a genuine philosophical position and, if you read the surrounding text honestly, something slightly more like a cry of identity. This is what we are. This is what we must remain, even when the world does not need us to be this. Confucian learning provided the intellectual framework within which all of this unfolded. The Tokugawa had adopted Neo-Confucianism as the official philosophy of the regime, and samurai were educated accordingly. Domain schools, the Hanko, taught the Confucian classics alongside history, calligraphy, and martial arts. The proper relationships between lord and vassal, parent and child, elder and younger, husband and wife, were studied and internalized from childhood. The synthesis that the Edo period produced was a particular kind of human being, cultured and disciplined in equal measure, equally expected to compose a passable poem and to maintain physical readiness for violence that would almost certainly never come. Equally comfortable, or at least equally trained to appear comfortable, with a writing brush and a sword. Whether this combination produced wisdom, or merely a very particular kind of anxiety, is a question the samurai asked themselves, in rather elegant prose, for 2.5 centuries. Women, loyalty, and the hidden stories. Any honest account of samurai culture has to contend with something that becomes apparent fairly quickly, once you start looking carefully at the historical record. The stories we know best, the ones that have been told and retold across centuries until they feel like the definitive version of what the samurai were, are almost entirely stories about men. The great battles, the famous swordsmen, the philosophical texts wrestling with death and loyalty and the nature of courage, the chronicles of spectacular treachery and spectacular faithfulness. These were worlds that women were largely excluded from in the official record, marginalized in the primary sources and often written out of the popular retelling entirely. This is not unusual in the history of pre-modern societies. It is, however, worth naming directly, because the samurai tradition has a particular tendency to present itself as comprehensive and complete, as a total account of a way of life, and a total account that leaves out roughly half the people involved in living it is something less than total. The truth, as it usually is when you look carefully, is more interesting than the simplified version. Women were not absent from samurai life. In some periods and some contexts, they were considerably more present, more powerful, and more consequential than the standard narrative has generally bothered to acknowledge. The Kamakura period offers some of the clearest evidence. Women in warrior families of the 12th and 13th centuries had inheritance rights that would be progressively curtailed in later centuries, as the system of warrior governance became more formalized and more influenced by Confucian ideas about the proper ordering of society. Daughters could inherit land. Widows could manage estates and make binding decisions about their administration. This was not equality by any standard that the modern world would recognize, but it was substantially more than women would have access to in the more rigidly hierarchical Edo period 3 centuries later. The early warrior class had not yet developed the elaborate social architecture that would eventually confine women's authority to the domestic sphere. Practical necessity in a world of constant conflict had a democratizing effect, at least by comparison with what came afterward. The most prominent individual example from this period is Hojo Masako, whose story has already appeared in these pages but deserves direct attention here. Masako was the wife of Minamoto no Yoritomo, the founder of the Kamakura shogunate. After his death in 1199, she took Buddhist vows, as was conventional for widows of her class, and then proceeded to exercise political authority over the shogunate that was anything but conventional. When her own father attempted to manipulate the succession to his own advantage, she addressed the assembled warriors of Kamakura directly, reminding them of the loyalty they owed to Yoritomo's legacy and appealing to their sense of honor and obligation. The warriors chose her cause over her father's. This was not a woman operating behind the scenes through whispered influence. This was a woman making a public political argument to a military audience and winning it. She was called the Nun Shogun, which is the kind of nickname that history only gives to people who genuinely earned it. The honor bugeisha, female warriors, appear across Japanese history in numbers that the simplified popular narrative has consistently underestimated. Their presence is documented, if unevenly, in chronicles, administrative records, and the occasional breathtaking archaeological discovery. A recent analysis of skeletal remains from the battlefield of Senbon Matsubaru, where a major engagement of the Sengoku period took place, found that a significant proportion of the warriors identified from their remains were female. This is the kind of finding that requires historians to quietly revise several paragraphs of previously confident prose. The most famous female warrior in the popular tradition is Tomoe Gosen, who fought alongside Minamoto no Yoshinaka during the Genpei War in the late 12th century. The tale of the Heike, the great chronicle of that conflict, describes her with language it reserves for only the most exceptional warriors. She was, the text says, a remarkably strong archer, a warrior worth 1,000. She is depicted cutting off an enemy's head in the midst of battle, bringing it to Yoshinaka as evidence of the deed. Whether Tomoe Gosen is entirely historical or has been shaped by the chronicle's literary traditions is genuinely uncertain, but her presence in the primary narrative of the Genpei War, told and copied by people who lived within living memory of the events, suggests that female warriors were at minimum imaginable to the society that produced the text, and that imagining them required no special explanation or justification. In the Sengoku period, when the fabric of social order was being stressed by continuous warfare, and the practical distinctions between warrior and non-warrior were frequently overridden by simple necessity, documented examples of women in military roles multiply. Inao Tora, who governed her family's domain in Totomi province through the turbulent middle decades of the 16th century, after the male members of her family were killed or died without adequate heirs, commanded the domain's warriors and administered its affairs for decades. She is a documented historical figure, not a legend. She appears in administrative records. She made decisions with real consequences. The current Japanese 10,000 yen note, issued as part of a redesign, features her portrait, which suggests that the appetite for recovering these stories has not diminished. During sieges, which were a common feature of Sengoku warfare, the distinction between warrior and non-warrior collapsed entirely. When an entire population was enclosed within castle walls, and the question was whether everyone inside would live or die, women took up the naginata and the bow alongside the men. This was not celebrated as exceptional behaviour. It was simply what the situation required, and the people in the situation responded to what was required of them. The Edo period narrowed all of this considerably, and the narrowing was deliberate. The Tokugawa system's adoption of Neo-Confucianism as its official intellectual framework brought with it Confucian ideas about the proper ordering of social roles, and those ideas were not favourable to female authority in public life. The idealised samurai woman of the Edo period was defined by virtues that were genuine but carefully bounded: obedience, loyalty to husband and family, the ability to manage a household with the same rigorous discipline that her husband was expected to bring to his administrative duties, composure in the face of difficulty, the capacity to endure without complaint what could not be changed. She was expected to bear children, particularly sons who would continue the family line and carry the warrior heritage forward. She was expected to maintain the household in her husband's extended absences, which in an era of sankinkotai, when lords and their retainers spent long periods in Edo, away from their home domains, could be very long indeed. She was expected to educate the children in the values of the warrior household, to be the living transmission of those values into the next generation. The short sword called kaiken was kept by samurai women for two purposes: self-defense if their home was attacked and their husband absent, which was a genuine practical concern, and suicide in the event of capture or violation, to preserve the honour that death could protect when life could not. This was presented as a mark of the samurai woman's equality in spirit with the male warrior, evidence that she shared his essential relationship with death, and his refusal to accept dishonour as an alternative to dying. Whether it felt like equality to the women who kept the kaiken beside their sleeping mats on nights when they were alone and the domain's defences were thin is a question the official record does not answer. There is something genuinely moving about many of these women's stories, even within the constraints of the values they inhabited and the system that shaped their lives. The letters written by samurai wives to husbands on campaign, warm and practical and unsentimental in the way that people who have learned to manage fear become unsentimental. The household diaries that record the management of an estate through drought and famine and epidemic disease, through the long absences and the occasional terrible news. The stories of women who, receiving word of a husband's death in battle, composed themselves, arranged the necessary affairs, made the necessary decisions, and continued, not because they felt nothing, but because the tradition they had been raised in said that this was what the mark of a warrior household looked like from the inside, and they had internalized that tradition completely enough to live by it in the worst moments. These women were not warriors in the Tomogozen sense, but they were participants in the samurai world in ways that mattered profoundly, and their stories are part of the complete account even when the official chronicles leave them out. Loyalty, which is the value most completely associated with samurai culture in the popular imagination, requires a similarly honest examination. As a stated ideal, loyalty in samurai culture was absolute and unconditional. You served your lord. You served him unto death. You served his memory after his death. You served without calculating the personal cost. This is what the texts say. This is what the formal culture insisted upon. What the historical record shows is somewhat more complicated and considerably more human. Medieval and early modern Japan was full of samurai who changed sides at the most advantageous possible moment, who calculated that their current lord was heading toward inevitable defeat and quietly opened negotiations with the likely winner before the battle was lost, who transferred their allegiance with a smoothness that suggests considerable practice. The word Gekkokujo, the lower overthrowing the upper, described a regular feature of Sengoku life rather than a scandalous aberration. Loyalty in practice was always a negotiation between ideal and reality, between what the code demanded and what survival suggested. The story of the 47 Ronin sits at the center of Japanese loyalty mythology precisely because it represents the ideal taken to its absolute extreme, enacted completely and at maximum personal cost. In 1701, the daimyo Asano Naganori drew his sword inside the shogun's palace and wounded an official named Kira Yoshinaka. Drawing a sword inside the palace was a capital offense regardless of provocation. Asano was ordered to commit seppuku that same day. His domain was confiscated and his retainers became ronin, masterless warriors without income or legal status. The Bakufu considered the matter settled. 47 of Asano's former retainers did not. Over the following 2 years they scattered, took up ordinary occupations, allowed themselves to be watched, and apparently dismissed as men who had made their practical peace with their lord's fate. And then, in the winter of 1703, they converged on Kira's fortified mansion in Edo at night, fought their way through his guards, found him hiding in a storage shed, and killed him. They took his head to Asano's grave at the temple of Sengokuji and placed it before the tomb. Then they surrendered to the authorities and were ordered to commit seppuku. They did so, all 47 of them, and were buried at Sengokuji beside their lord. Japan has been talking about this story ever since, which is now well over 300 years of continuous conversation. It has been staged as kabuki, performed as bunraku puppet theatre, filmed more times than anyone has bothered to count accurately, adapted as manga and television drama, and at least one regrettable Hollywood production that added supernatural elements, presumably on the theory that 47 men committing ritual suicide for their dead lord was not dramatic enough on its own. The story endures because it asks questions that have no clean answers and never will. Was the revenge morally justified? Almost certainly, given what was done to their lord. Was it legally justified? Clearly not, which is why they were executed. Did the Bakufu make the right decision in ordering their deaths? Scholars have been arguing about this since 1703. Does loyalty have limits? Or is loyalty that calculates limits not really loyalty at all? Does a code that demands this level of sacrifice from human beings deserve the reverence it receives? These questions have no clean answers. That is precisely, and probably not coincidentally, why the story keeps being told. The Black Ships and the end of an era. For over 2 centuries, Japan had maintained its carefully managed relationship with the outside world. Carefully managed is perhaps the key phrase there. This was not ignorance. The Dutch trading post on the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki harbour had been Japan's primary window onto Western development since the 1630s, and Japanese scholars of Rangaku, Dutch learning, had followed the progress of European science, astronomy and medicine with genuine and serious interest. Books were translated, anatomy was studied, astronomical instruments were examined. The shogunate knew that the world beyond its shores was changing. It simply believed, with the particular confidence of a system that had worked for a very long time, that it could continue to manage how much of that change was allowed to enter. What it could not manage, and what no amount of careful policy could hold at bay indefinitely, was the sheer scale of transformation occurring in European and American military and industrial capacity during the early 19th century. This was not a gradual drift. It was a rupture. Steam-powered warships that did not depend on wind or oar, industrial production of firearms in quantities and at speeds that no traditional craft system could match, an international order being actively and violently reshaped by European colonial expansion across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The world that Japan had sealed itself away from in the 1630s had not stood still and waited politely for Japan to rejoin it. It had become something almost unrecognizable. The clearest warning came from China. The Qing dynasty, which Japan had long regarded as the great continental civilization and a source of cultural prestige, had been forced open by Britain in the Opium Wars of the 1840s. A country with a population of hundreds of millions, ancient traditions of statecraft and considerable military resources had been compelled by a relatively small British expeditionary force to accept humiliating treaty terms. The implications for Japan were not subtle and they were not difficult to read. If China could not resist, Japan certainly could not resist in its current condition. The question was not whether pressure would come. The question was when and from whom, and whether Japan would have anything adequate to meet it with. The answer to the first question arrived on July 8, 1853. 4 American warships sailed into Edo Bay, 2 of them steam-powered, their black iron hulls sitting low and purposeful in the water, their smokestacks producing the kind of black smoke that the coastal observers had never seen from a ship. They were commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry, a man who understood that in diplomacy, as in so many other fields, the conversation is shaped before it begins by what you bring to the table. What Perry brought to the table was, among other things, the ability to reduce coastal installations to rubble from a comfortable distance. Perry carried a letter from President Millard Fillmore, a president whose name history has not treated with particular reverence but whose letter carried genuine consequence. The letter requested the opening of trade relations, the establishment of diplomatic contacts, and the provision of ports where American ships could coal and resupply on the increasingly important trans-Pacific routes. The language was diplomatic. The implication was not. Perry would return the following year for Japan's answer. He did not specify what would happen if Japan's answer was unsatisfactory, because he did not need to. The ships in the harbour made that argument without words. The Japanese called them kurafun, black ships. The name captured something beyond mere colour. These were vessels from a different order of the world, running on fire and iron rather than wind and timber, indifferent to the seasonal rhythms and the careful protocols that had governed Japan's controlled relationship with the sea. The psychological impact of their arrival was immense and immediate. The Tokugawa shogunate, that 2.5-century-old institution of meticulous control and enforced stability, suddenly found itself facing a situation for which nothing in its considerable experience had prepared it. The coastal defences were adequate against pirates. They were decorative against naval bombardment. Japan had no ships that could challenge Perry's squadron. It had no doctrine for managing this kind of pressure. It had essentially no good options. Perry returned in February of 1854, this time with 8 vessels, having apparently decided that if 4 warships constituted a polite request, 8 constituted a firm one. The shogunate, after considerable internal debate and significant political anguish, signed the Convention of Kanagawa, opening 2 ports to American ships. It was the beginning of a process that could not be stopped once started. Within a few years, under the accumulated pressure of similar demands from Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Russia, Japan had signed a series of what became known as the unequal treaties. More ports opened. Extraterritoriality was established for foreign nationals, meaning that Western citizens in Japan were subject to their own laws rather than Japanese ones, a provision that was as practically offensive as it sounds. Tariffs were set by foreign powers rather than by Japan, stripping the country of control over its own trade. Japan had been, in the most technical diplomatic sense, opened. The opening felt, to those who experienced it, considerably more like a forced entry. These were humiliating arrangements, and they were humiliating in a way that resonated with specific and devastating force inside a culture that had placed enormous value on self-sufficiency, on the integrity of the divine country, on the idea that Japan was a place under special protection that had successfully kept foreign domination at bay. The storms that had destroyed the Mongol fleets in the 13th century were part of the national story. The successful management of the Dutch at Dejima, allowing trade on Japanese terms, was part of the national story. The story being written now was a different kind entirely, and everyone who could read it knew it. The shogunate's handling of the crisis did not merely fail, it destroyed what remained of its political legitimacy in ways that could not be repaired. The decision to consult the imperial court before signing the treaties was perhaps the most consequential single mistake. For 2.5 centuries the shogunate had made its decisions autonomously, presenting the imperial court with outcomes rather than asking for guidance. By breaking that precedent, by appearing to seek imperial sanction for what it was doing, the shogunate implicitly acknowledged that imperial authority was real and relevant. Having made that acknowledgement, it then received from the court not approval, but criticism. The emperor had not sanctioned the opening of the country. The shogunate had done it anyway. The resulting political situation was genuinely impossible to navigate cleanly. The slogan that crystallized among the shogunate's opponents captured the new political landscape precisely and dangerously. Sono joi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. 4 words that accomplished the considerable feat of combining a demand for imperial restoration with a demand for national resistance to foreign encroachment. It was a slogan designed to make the shogunate the villain of both stories simultaneously, both the body that had failed to protect Japan from foreigners and the body that had usurped authority that properly belonged to the emperor. For men who had grown up in a system where the shogunate's authority was simply the background condition of political life, the speed with which that authority now seemed to dissolve was disorienting. The anti-foreign sentiment produced violence that was not rhetorical. In the early 1860s, foreign nationals were attacked on the roads leading to Yokohama and Edo. The British legation in Edo was burned. Western merchant ships were fired upon in coastal waters by domains whose lords had decided that the foreigners needed to be shown what Japanese resolution looked like. The response from the Western powers was to demonstrate with naval bombardment of the offending coastal domains that Japanese resolution and Western industrial firepower were not comparable quantities. Choshu domain's shore batteries, which had fired on foreign shipping in the Straits of Shimonoseki, were systematically destroyed by a combined Western fleet in 1864. Satsuma domain, which had killed a British merchant on the Tokaido Road, was bombarded at Kagoshima in 1863. The lesson was being delivered with expensive and systematic clarity. Inside Japan, the political landscape was fracturing in ways that ran along fault lines much older than the Perry Crisis. The Tokugawa shogunate retained the loyalty of some domains and faced the growing opposition of others, particularly the powerful Tozuma domains of Satsuma and Choshu in western Japan. These were the outside lords, the domains whose ancestors had submitted to Ieyasu after Sekigahara and had never entirely made their peace with the requirement. They had been managed for 2.5 centuries, kept at arm's length from real power, watched carefully, their alliances monitored and their fortifications counted. They had been waiting, in the patient way of institutions that know they are waiting for the conditions to change. The conditions had now changed in the most dramatic possible fashion. What made the situation genuinely unprecedented, and what revealed how thoroughly the world had shifted, was that the questions now animating Japanese political life were not primarily the traditional questions of loyalty and legitimacy, of which lord deserved allegiance and which lineage held the mandate. They were questions of a different and more urgent kind. Could Japan survive as an independent nation in a world where the measure of power was a steam-powered warship? Could the existing political system adapt quickly enough to meet the challenge? Or would it drag the country into humiliation and eventual colonization through its own rigidity? Was the only way to resist Western technology the acquisition of Western technology? And if you acquired it, what became of everything you had been? The samurai class, that elaborately trained and philosophically self-conscious institution, was having this argument with itself at every level. Some samurai looked at what the Western powers had done to China and concluded with cold pragmatism that the only path to survival was transformation, that you learned from your enemies or you became their subject. Others concluded with equal conviction that accommodation was simply betrayal, dressed in the language of necessity, that the divine country could not be defended by becoming something other than itself. Both positions had genuine force. Both were held by serious people with serious arguments. The resolution, when it came, was not found in debate. It was found, as so many things in samurai Japan had always ultimately been found, on the battlefield, the Meiji Restoration and the death of the samurai. In 1868, a coalition of domains led by Satsuma and Choshu overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate in a conflict known as the Boshin War. The fighting was relatively brief and in some regions almost bloodless, a reflection of how thoroughly the shogunate's legitimacy had already collapsed before the first shot was fired. The Emperor Meiji, who was 15 years old at the time, was restored to nominal authority in what history calls the Meiji Restoration. He would lend his name to one of the most dramatic national transformations in recorded history, a transformation that would remake Japan from the foundation upward in the space of a single generation. The slogan changed almost immediately. Sono Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, had served its purpose as a rallying cry against the Tokugawa. It was now quietly set aside, because the men who had used it most effectively had spent enough time studying Western military technology to understand that expelling the barbarians in any literal sense was not a realistic program. What was realistic? What was in fact the only viable path to national survival in a world of industrialized imperial powers was something that would have seemed genuinely extraordinary to the samurai of previous centuries and genuinely appalling to some of the samurai of the current one. Japan would modernize. Japan would industrialize. Japan would build railways and telegraph lines and a modern navy and a conscript army and Western-style legal codes and a constitutional government. It would transform itself into a nation-state on the Western model, and it would do so with the focused speed and collective discipline of a military campaign. The samurai who had fought to restore imperial authority, who had risked their lives and in many cases sacrificed their friends and kinsmen to bring down the Tokugawa system, now found themselves living in the country their victory had produced. And it was not, it turned out, a country that had much use for samurai in their traditional form. The revolution they had made was eating what they had assumed they were fighting for, which is one of the more reliable patterns in the history of revolutions. The changes came rapidly, and with a thoroughness that left little room for negotiation. In 1871, the domains were abolished and replaced with a centralized prefectural system administered by officials appointed by the new national government. The daimyo, those regional lords whose authority had been the organizing principle of Japanese political life for centuries, were compensated financially and incorporated into a new aristocratic peerage on the European model. They were given titles and pensions and removed from actual governance. It was done with considerable tact and considerable speed, before the implications had fully registered. In 1873, universal military conscription was established. Every male Japanese subject of eligible age, regardless of social origin, regardless of lineage, regardless of whether his ancestors had carried swords or carried hoes, was potentially a soldier of the new Japan. This was the blow that struck at the samurai identity most directly, even more than the economic changes that accompanied it. The samurai monopoly on military service had defined the class for centuries. It was not merely an economic privilege, though it was that. It was the foundational justification for the samurai's existence as a distinct social category. Warriors existed because war required specialists. Specialists were defined by their monopoly on the practice of organized violence. Remove the monopoly and the justification dissolves with it. A farmer's son with a rifle and 6 months of training was as effective on a modern battlefield as a samurai's son with a lifetime of martial cultivation. He was also, from the government's perspective, considerably cheaper to maintain and considerably less likely to have complicated feelings about loyalty to his former domain lord. The economic basis of samurai existence had been eroding quietly through the long Edo period. Stipends denominated in rice had declined in real value as the economy became increasingly monetized. Many low-ranking samurai had been genuinely poor for generations, maintaining the outward forms of warrior status while privately struggling to eat adequately. The Meiji government's solution to this lingering obligation was direct and final. In 1876, the remaining stipends were converted into government bonds. The samurai class was effectively bought out, its members compensated for the permanent termination of their hereditary income. Whether the compensation was adequate depended enormously on your rank. Senior retainers of wealthy domains received bonds of real value. Low-ranking samurai of poor domains received very little. The transaction was concluded. The economic relationship between warrior class and state was severed. Also in 1876 came the Haito Rei, the Sword Abolition Edict, which prohibited the wearing of swords in public. Police and military personnel were exempted. Everyone else, including every man who had spent his entire life understanding the sword on his hip as the most fundamental visible expression of who and what he was now forbidden to wear one. It is worth pausing here, because this requires some imagination to fully appreciate. The samurai had been the warrior class of Japan for roughly 700 years. 7 centuries during which the sword was not merely a weapon, but the soul of the warrior, the physical embodiment of his status, his lineage, his honor, and his readiness to die in service of his obligations. Samurai boys received their first practice swords in childhood ceremonies. A samurai's swords were given names and treated with a reverence that bordered on the religious. The right to wear 2 swords in public was, quite literally, what being a samurai looked like to anyone who saw you walking down a street. And now it was forbidden. Not regulated, not restricted, forbidden. In the space of roughly a decade, the world that several generations of samurai had been born into had ceased to exist, not declined, not transformed gradually into something else, ceased to exist by legal decree with considerable administrative efficiency. The responses to this dissolution covered the full range of human possibility. Some former samurai adapted with a speed that was genuinely remarkable and speaks well of their practical intelligence and flexibility. The modernizing Meiji state needed educated people. It needed men who were literate, disciplined, accustomed to administrative responsibility, capable of learning new systems quickly and applying them rigorously. Former samurai had exactly these qualities in abundance. The same educational tradition that had produced men equally trained in calligraphy and sword fighting now produced the first generation of Meiji bankers, bureaucrats, military officers, diplomats, and industrialists. Many of the leading architects of Japanese modernization, the men who built the new army and navy, who established the first modern banks, who negotiated with foreign powers and designed the constitutional framework of the new state, were former samurai who had simply redirected the considerable energies of their training into entirely new channels. The self-cultivation tradition served them beautifully. They knew how to study, they knew how to discipline themselves toward mastery. They applied those capacities to the mastery of modernity. Others could not make the crossing. Former samurai who had built their identities entirely around values and skills for which the new Japan had no institutional place, found themselves adrift in ways that poverty alone does not fully explain. Some fell into genuine destitution, unable to translate warrior cultivation into commercial viability in an economy that rewarded different things. Some retreated into nostalgia and resentment, looking back at the Edo period with a selective memory that softened its considerable frustrations and remembered only its coherence and its clarity about what a man was supposed to be. Several rebellions broke out across the 1870s in different parts of Japan, most of them small and quickly suppressed, all of them led by former samurai who felt, with varying degrees of justification, that the revolution they had helped make had betrayed the values they thought they were fighting for. The most serious of these was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, and it requires its own careful attention, because it is the closest thing Japanese history has to a true final chapter for the samurai as a historical force. Its leader was Saigo Takamori, and if you wanted to design a figure who embodied the impossible contradictions of the Meiji transformation, you could not do much better than Saigo. He was one of the most important military commanders of the Meiji Restoration itself. His strategic and organizational contributions to the defeat of the Tokugawa shogunate were central and acknowledged. He then served in the early Meiji government, a member of the inner circle of men building the new Japan. He was not a reactionary who had opposed modernization from the beginning. He had helped create the thing he eventually turned against. His break with the government came over questions of policy and direction that were genuine and serious. He had supported a punitive expedition against Korea following a diplomatic incident, arguing that Japan needed both to assert itself internationally and to provide the former samurai class with a purpose, a war that would give them something to be. The government declined, calculating that Japan was not yet strong enough for foreign military adventures and that the domestic transformation had to take priority. Saigo resigned and returned to Satsuma, where he established schools for former samurai and gathered around him a community of men who shared his sense that something irreplaceable had been surrendered in the rush toward modernity. What that something was is not entirely easy to articulate, which is perhaps part of why it expressed itself eventually as rebellion, rather than as reasoned argument. It was partly about the warrior values that the new Japan was paper-thin about, rather than genuinely honouring. It was partly about the specific indignity of the sword abolition edict. It was partly about men who had been excellent at one thing finding themselves in a world that had decided that thing was obsolete. And it was partly about Saigo himself, who seems to have been the kind of person for whom a certain quality of commitment and intensity was simply the condition of feeling alive, and who found the administrative compromises of the Meiji government an insufficient substitute for that feeling. In 1877, the community around Saigo erupted into open rebellion. 40,000 men, the great majority of them former samurai, took up arms and fought the Meiji government's conscript army through the mountains and valleys of Kyushu in a campaign that stretched across 9 months and cost both sides dearly. The rebels were brave in ways that are not in question. They were skilled in ways that the young conscripts sometimes found genuinely alarming, and they were outgunned in ways that made the eventual outcome inevitable to anyone capable of doing the relevant arithmetic. The government's forces had modern artillery, repeating rifles, and an industrial supply chain that could replace losses and sustain campaigns indefinitely. The rebels had swords, pride, and firearms that were adequate for an earlier era of warfare and catastrophically insufficient for this one. Saigo's last stand came at the hill of Shiroyama outside Kagoshima in September of 1877. 30,000 government troops surrounded a few hundred surviving rebels on a hill from which there was no realistic escape. Saigo led a final charge downhill into the government lines and was killed. Some accounts say he was already wounded and had a retainer assist him in a form of seppuku before the charge. Others say he fell in the fighting itself. The details are uncertain. What is certain is that he refused to surrender, and that he was 49 years old, and that the rebellion ended with him. The government, to its credit, gave him a full military funeral, and Saigo Takamori has remained a celebrated figure in Japan from that day to this one, which tells you something genuinely interesting about the texture of the Meiji period and about Japanese historical memory. The man who embodied the last armed resistance to the modernizing New Japan is also the man whose military genius helped create it. His bronze statue stands in Ueno Park in Tokyo, a large figure in military dress with a dog at his heels, looking out with an expression that is difficult to read over the city that modernization built on the foundations that his rebellion could not stop. The city went on. The statue remained. The contradiction between them has never quite been resolved, and perhaps that is appropriate. Some contradictions are more honest left standing than explained away. The Last Samurai and the legend that refused to die. Saigo's death at Shiroyama in September of 1877 is often called the death of the samurai, and in a structural, legal and economic sense, that description is accurate. After 1877, there was no samurai class. The legal category had been abolished. The stipends had been converted to bonds and the bonds issued. The swords had been forbidden in public. The domains that had sustained samurai communities for centuries had been replaced by prefectures administered by appointed officials. There were former samurai who were now private citizens, military officers, bureaucrats, school teachers, businessmen, and in some cases desperately poor men with impressive lineages and no practical way of sustaining themselves. But there was no longer a legally defined warrior class with special privileges, special obligations, and the right to carry 2 swords on their hips as visible proof of who they were. The institution was gone. The question was what remained after it. The answer turned out to be considerably more than anyone might have predicted, and considerably more complicated than the simple story of a warrior class dying with its swords in hand would suggest, because the samurai did not die as an idea. They did not die as an image, as an ethical framework, as a set of cultural reference points, or as a source of national identity. They died as a legal and economic reality, and were immediately reborn as something more powerful and more dangerous than they had ever been in their actual historical form. They became a myth, and myths, as any historian will tell you with a slightly tired expression, are considerably harder to kill than institutions. The Meiji period needed a national identity with some urgency. Japan was transforming itself at a speed that had no real historical precedent, adopting Western technology, Western legal systems, Western styles of dress for government officials, Western military organization, Western banking, Western railways, Western postal systems. The transformation was deliberate and systematic and genuinely astonishing in its scope. A country that had been largely sealed from external contact for over 2 centuries was consciously remaking itself as a modern nation-state in the space of a single generation. This required enormous energy, enormous sacrifice, and an answer to a question that modernization always eventually forces. What are we, underneath all of this? What do we remain when we change everything on the surface? The imperial institution was central to the answer. The Meiji Restoration had placed the emperor at the formal center of the new state's legitimacy in ways that the Tokugawa period had not. The emperor was now not merely the ceremonial occupant of a Kyoto palace, while the shogunate ran the country. He was the source of constitutional authority, the embodiment of the nation, the figure around whom the new Japan organized its loyalty. The move of the imperial court to Tokyo, the former Edo, made this concrete and physical. The emperor was in the capital. The capital was the center of a modernizing nation, and the nation needed a story about itself that was older and deeper than steam engines and railway timetables. The samurai tradition provided exactly that story, or rather it provided the raw materials from which that story could be constructed, and constructed it was, with considerable deliberateness and considerable skill. Around the emperor and the new state, a national mythology took shape that drew heavily on the warrior tradition, presenting the values associated with the samurai: loyalty, discipline, courage, willingness to sacrifice, contempt for mere self-interest, as the essential and eternal qualities of the Japanese people, not the qualities of a particular social class that had existed for particular historical reasons and had now been legally dissolved. The eternal spirit of Japan itself. Bushido as a systematic philosophy was largely a product of this process. The word had appeared earlier, and warrior values had been articulated across centuries of Japanese history. But the codification of Bushido as the definitive ethical framework of the samurai, and by extension of the Japanese nation, was significantly a Meiji period project. Nitobe Inaso's book Bushido, The Soul of Japan, published in 1899 and written in English for a Western audience, presented the samurai ethos as Japan's answer to Western chivalry, a sophisticated moral tradition that proved Japan was a civilized nation in terms that Western readers would recognize and respect. The loyalty, discipline, and willingness to sacrifice that the samurai were supposed to embody were repackaged as national virtues rather than class-specific warrior values. Every Japanese citizen, the argument went, carried samurai spirit within them. The class was gone. The spirit was universal and eternal. This ideological repackaging was not merely a cultural project. It had direct and practical military consequences. The conscript army that had defeated Saigo's former samurai at Shiroyama was itself being actively infused with samurai values, or rather with the Meiji period's particular version of samurai values. Military training combined Western tactical doctrine with the ethical language of the warrior tradition. The sword, which was no longer a daily accessory for anyone, became a ceremonial weapon for officers, physically present as a link to the warrior past even within a thoroughly modernized military structure. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors of 1882 instructed Japanese troops that their primary virtues were loyalty, courtesy, valor, faithfulness, and simplicity. The language was simultaneously Confucian and Bushido-inflected, old wine in a new military flask designed to make the conscript farmer's son feel that he was heir to something ancient and honorable. For a while, in the late 19th and early 20th century, this synthesis produced results that seemed to validate the project. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, in which Japan defeated a major European power in both land and naval engagements, sent a shock through the international system and confirmed within Japan the sense that the combination of Western technology and Japanese spirit was genuinely potent. Japan was the first non-Western nation to defeat a Western power in modern warfare, and the warrior tradition was woven into how that victory was understood and celebrated. The soldiers who charged Russian positions at Port Arthur and the sailors who destroyed the Russian Baltic fleet at Tsushima were presented as samurai in modern uniform, their courage drawing on a well that ran back through centuries. But the synthesis was developing a flaw that would take decades to become fully visible. The samurai tradition as it had actually existed was complicated, self-questioning, and in many of its most honest moments quite aware of its own contradictions. The Hagakure worried about whether warriors were losing their essential identity. The 47 Ronin story raised genuine questions about loyalty and legality and what you owe to the dead. Miyamoto Musashi's philosophy was about adaptability and clear seeing, not about rigid self-destruction. The actual historical samurai, for all his training in the facing of death, had usually been more interested in living well and serving effectively than in dying at the earliest opportunity. The ideological version of Bushido that the Meiji state constructed and that deepened through the early 20th century progressively stripped away these complications. As Japan moved through the nationalism of the 1930s and into the total war of the 1930s and 40s, the samurai ideal was weaponized in ways that the actual samurai tradition, for all its genuine embrace of martial values, had never quite intended. The willingness to die rather than surrender, which in the historical warrior context had been a choice made in specific circumstances by individuals operating within a particular set of social obligations, was elevated into a universal national obligation. Surrender became not merely shameful but essentially un-Japanese. Death in service of the emperor became the explicit ideal toward which every soldier was directed. The kamikaze pilots who flew their aircraft into Allied warships in the final years of the Pacific War borrowed their name directly from the divine winds that had destroyed the Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century, and the borrowing was entirely deliberate. They were presented as the living expression of the samurai spirit, warriors who had transcended the merely human concern for personal survival and given themselves completely to a cause larger than themselves. They were very young. Many of them wrote letters home before their final flights that are almost unbearable to read. Letters full of ordinary human feeling, love for parents, regret for things not done, awareness of what was being given up. The ideology said they were samurai incarnate. The letters suggest they were young men doing something terrible, because the world they had grown up in had told them it was the only honourable thing left to do. Japan's defeat in 1945 was followed by a reckoning with all of this that was painful in proportion to the investment that had been made. The American occupation reformed Japanese education, removed militarist content from textbooks, and systematically dismantled the ideological apparatus that had connected the samurai tradition to imperial nationalism and total war. The samurai narrative was not banned outright, but its relationship to the catastrophe that had just ended was made explicit and unavoidable. For a generation of Japanese who had lived through the war and its aftermath, the tradition carried complicated weight. Its beauty was real. The uses to which that beauty had been put were also real. Holding both of those things simultaneously was not comfortable. And then the world fell in love with samurai movies, and everything became complicated in an entirely different direction. Akira Kurosawa had begun making films in the 1940s, working within a Japanese cinema that was already sophisticated and accomplished. His samurai films of the 1950s and 60s created images that travelled across every cultural boundary with a directness that surprised even their creator. Rashomon in 1950 used a samurai murder as the framework for an exploration of subjective truth and the impossibility of a single reliable account of any human event. Seven Samurai in 1954 followed 7 warriors hired to defend a farming village against bandits, and it was specifically, self-consciously, and heartbreakingly about the end of the samurai world. The warriors in Seven Samurai are brilliant and broken and deeply human. They win the battle and they lose everything that winning costs them, and the farmers they defended plant their rice and continue, and the world belongs to the farmers now, not the warriors. Kurosawa's samurai are not idealized figures from a national mythology. They are human beings with extraordinary skills and all the human vulnerabilities those skills cannot protect them from. That honesty is precisely what made the film universal. Seven Samurai influenced Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns so directly that Leone's A Fistful of Dollars is essentially a retelling of Yojimbo, Kurosawa's 1961 film about a wandering swordsman playing rival gangs against each other. Through Leone, that influence shaped American cinema at a foundational level. George Lucas has acknowledged the debt that Star Wars owes to Kurosawa, particularly The Hidden Fortress. The Jedi, with their swords and their codes and their meditative discipline, are samurai in space, and nobody in the audience needs to know that to feel it. The imagery speaks directly. The Force is not so far from the Zen concept of Mushin, the empty mind that responds without hesitation. The lightsaber duel is a kenjutsu match with the serial numbers filed off. Outside Japan, the samurai became one of the most immediately recognizable archetypes in global popular culture, and the question of why is worth sitting with for a moment. The armor and the sword and the code of honor translate across cultural boundaries in ways that the specific historical details of Japanese feudalism do not, because they address questions that are not specific to any culture or any century. What do we owe to our commitments when honoring them cost everything? How do we face the fact of our own death with something other than terror? What is the relationship between mastered technique and genuine wisdom? What does it mean to try to live with honor in a world that does not consistently reward it and sometimes actively punishes it? These questions were not invented by the samurai. Every human culture has asked versions of them. But the samurai tradition addressed them with a particular intensity, a particular aesthetic sensibility, and an extraordinary gift for generating stories that carry the weight of those questions without collapsing under it. And stories, as anyone who has spent a long night listening to history already knows, are how civilizations remember themselves, argue with themselves, and pass on to their children the things that matter most. The samurai are gone as a historical reality. They remain as a story that the world keeps telling, in new forms and new languages, because the questions they lived inside have not yet been answered to anyone's complete satisfaction. They probably never will be. That is why we keep telling the story. What the samurai left behind. We are near the end of our journey now. The fire is low. The night is quiet. And it is worth taking a moment to consider what, across all these centuries of rice fields and castles, and death poems and tea rooms and burning palaces and naval disasters, and philosophical texts and wooden puppets and bronze Buddhas and typhoons and 16-year-old emperors, the samurai actually left behind. The physical legacy is still visible. The great castles of Japan, Himeji with its white towers rising in tiers against the mountain, Matsumoto with its black walls reflected in the moat, Osaka rebuilt but still massive on its stone foundations, are the most obvious monuments of the warrior age. The Zen gardens of Kyoto, the rock and gravel arrangements of Rionji, the moss gardens of Saihoji, the carefully maintained landscapes of Kenrokuen in Kanazawa, these are samurai period creations, expressions of aesthetics developed in the warrior court. The tea ceremony still exists as a living practice. Martial arts derived from samurai training, kendo, judo, aikido, iaido, have practitioners around the world. The ethical legacy is more ambiguous but more pervasive. The Japanese values of meticulous craft, of finding a way to the essential heart of a practice and refining it indefinitely, of treating work as a form of self-cultivation rather than merely as a means to an end. These values have roots throughout Japanese history and culture, not only in the samurai tradition, but the samurai tradition amplified and articulated them in ways that gave them particular force. The idea that whatever you do, you should do it with full commitment and genuine attention, whether it's preparing tea or writing a poem or cutting wood. This is recognizably Zen, recognizably samurai, and recognizably present in contemporary Japanese culture. The literary legacy gave Japanese culture some of its most enduring texts. The Tale of the Heike, which chronicles the Genpei War in prose of extraordinary beauty. The Pillow Book and the Tale of Genji, technically not samurai texts, but products of the Heian world from which the warrior class emerged. The poems of the military chronicles and the love poems of the warrior poets who found time, somehow, between campaigns to write of autumn moonlight and the sadness of parting. The Hagakure and the Book of Five Rings, philosophical texts of the warrior tradition that continue to be read. The artistic legacy is global. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints influenced the European Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. Hokusai's Great Wave is reproduced on products in every country on Earth. Kurosawa's films shaped cinema worldwide. The visual language of samurai armor and weaponry has entered global design, fantasy, and science fiction as enduring aesthetic shorthand for a particular combination of beauty and lethal intent. And then there is the legacy that is hardest to quantify. The samurai were human beings who faced the universal human problems: mortality, loyalty, meaning, the tension between individual honor and collective obligation, with unusual directness and unusual resources for grappling with them. They developed practices, philosophies, arts, and stories in response to these problems. Not all of their answers were correct. Not all of their solutions were humane. The samurai tradition enabled extraordinary beauty and also considerable cruelty. History is always this way. But at their best, at the moments when the tradition was most genuine and least corrupted by ideology or vanity, the samurai pointed towards something real, that a life lived with full commitment and clear attention is worth living, that beauty is not incompatible with difficulty, that the awareness of death, held steadily rather than pushed away, can illuminate rather than diminish the time we have, that the relationship between a person and their work, whatever that work may be, can be a place of genuine meaning. The cherry blossoms fall every spring. They have done so for 10,000 years, and will do so for 10,000 more. They fall in a week. They are beautiful precisely because they fall. The samurai understood this in their bones, and you, tonight, wherever you are in your corner of the world, with the lights low and the fan humming and the hours moving gently toward morning, you understand it too. The swords are silent, the battles are long done, the castles stand, the poems remain, and the night, as always, is very quiet. Rest now.